Okay, welcome everyone. This is Dr. Lindner, and we are going to start our very first session. And when we open up anatomy and physiology, one of the very first things that we have to understand is that anatomy and physiology is a language. It's a language unto itself. And the words that we use are really important to understand. There are there are some terms that come from Greek and Arabic and Latin. So it comes from so many different cultures. When we look at an individual that's standing facing forward, as we see here in this first picture, we call this anatomical position. Anatomical position is when the person is standing erect, the feet are flat on the floor, the arms are at the side, and the palms, the palmar surface and the palms of the hand are facing forward, also known as facing anterior or anteriorly. What we see from the front is everything in this woman's anterior. What we can't see is everything on the woman's posterior. So we're already hearing some terms, anterior and posterior. These are opposite terms. There is some other positions, and let me go back here for 1 second. Her hands facing forward is also known as the supine position. Her hands are in the supine position, facing forward. And if her elbows were bent at 90 degrees, she can actually hold soup in her hands. So when you're holding soup, you are in the supine or supinated position. And if your hands turn over like you're spilling the soup, then that's pronated or prone to spilling the soup. It's a little visual. When you are facing down, we call that prone or pronated. If this person was facing up, we would say the person is supine or supinated. We already know what anatomical position is. So here on the top, you can see you have these little like drag and drop boxes. So this came from one of the exercises that students had to do in one of my past labs. So in this position, we would say, well, they're lying face up. This is also the supine position, and supine is the opposite of prone. If we look at the bottom, the person lying face down is prone, because when you're prone, you're on the bone. Prone is on the bone, meaning the nose. Supine is lying on your spine. Supine is lying on your spine. Prone is on the bone, lying face down on your nose, and it's also the opposite of supine. Here, in the middle, this person is standing upright, which we said is anatomical position, and their feet are flat on the floor. The part of the foot that is flat on the floor is referred to as the plantar surface. The palm of the hand is called the palmar surface. The foot has a plantar surface. In terms of anatomy and physiology, it's basically the study of structure and function. Structure and function. Anatomy is the study of structure. Physiology is the study of how things function, and they do go hand in hand. Structure determines function, and helping to maintain function, right? When you function, that helps to maintain structure. So structure function is like a two-way street. They work in both directions. We can study anatomy by doing dissection, by looking at x-rays, MRIs, CAT scans, all different ways of studying human structure. We can also look at it microscopically, looking at things under a microscope to understand structure. And we will look at that when we get into next week, week 2, when we talk about histology and we talk about the different types of tissues. Physiology is how things function. So when we get into, let's say, muscles, we have to understand how muscles contract. that is a functional thing. Nerves send messages to muscles. There's also a lot of chemicals and chemistry involved, like calcium, that's involved in muscle contraction. So that's all involved in the physiology. So anatomy is structure, physiology is the function. Structure determines function. Here, you heard me say a little while ago that we can study anatomy also microscopically. And when we're studying the cell, we call that cytology. Anytime you see CYT, cyte, cytology is the study of their cells and their structures. There are some terms that you will hear as we move on in this term, like osteocyte, chondrocyte, myocyte. So osteocyte just means it's a bone cell. Myocyte tells you it's a muscle cell. Hepatocyte, hepa, like hepatitis, it's a liver cell. Histology, on the other hand, that is when you bring a bunch of cells together. Cells coming together make tissues. And when we study tissues, that is the study of histology. In order to create a cell, we need chemistry, so chemicals. Even at the molecular level, chemistry comes together, whether it is carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, whether it's carbons, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, right? Chemicals come together and help to create cells. And then a bunch of cells come together and make tissues. And then a bunch of tissues come together to make organs, like the heart and the stomach and the kidney and the spleen. And then organs come together and make systems, like the digestive system or the cardiovascular system or the endocrine system and the skeletal system, right? We have 11 different systems. And all those 11 systems come together and they make the organism, which is the crowning creation of all. Here's just a little visual that lets us know at the chemical or molecular level, these things come together, whether it be atoms and protein filaments and carbons and oxygen and carbohydrates and proteins and fats. All those things come together to make a cell. And in this particular instance, we're looking at a heart muscle cell. This is a heart cell. But a bunch of heart cells come together to make cardiac tissue. That's called muscle tissue. And then cardiac muscle tissue, that comes together, and that will eventually create the heart. But the heart, along with its extension of tubes called arteries and veins and capillaries, that's called the cardiovascular system. And then the cardiovascular system, along with the other 10 systems, we have 11 in total, that creates the organism. So here, this is a little exercise that was either in the Atlas or in the APR, where you have to click and drag, right? You would have choices off to the side. And when you see the bones, you would have to drag skeletal system here. When you see the brain and the spinal cord and nerves, that is the neural system. When we're looking at the lungs and the trachea and the nose, that is the respiratory system. When you're looking at the heart with all of its corresponding blood vessels, arteries and veins and capillaries, that's the circulatory system. And when we look at the kidneys with the ureter and the urinary bladder, that's the urinary system. We can further break down the skeleton into a few other components. What we see in the center, like the skull, the spine, the ribs, everything that we see in the center, including the sacrum, this would be considered the axial skeleton. And everything outside of that, including the upper and lower extremities, would be the appendicular skeletal system. Okay? A lot of things are broken down into, even if we look at the neural system, there's a central neural system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral neural system, which is everything in the periphery of the brain and spinal cord, like all of these branches of nerves coming off of the spinal cord. That is peripheral neural system, and even nerves that come off the brain, like cranial nerves, are considered to be peripheral neural system. When you look at the respiratory system, we know there's an upper respiratory and a lower respiratory, because we've all heard in the past he or she may have an upper respiratory tract infection or a lower respiratory tract infection. Here, again, now we have more systems. When we're looking at the intestines and the colon and the stomach, well, that's your digestive system. When you're looking at everything from the exterior, superficially, there's another word, superficial, all of your skin, hair, and nails, that's called the integument or the integumentary system. Then we have the endocrine system, which is the thyroid and the thymus and the kidneys and the pancreas. These are little glands that produce hormones. And the endocrine system is a messenger system, much like the neural system. The neural system uses a chemical called neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system uses messengers called hormones. Then we have the muscular system. There's over 600 muscles in the body. And we can learn them again as axial muscles or appendicular muscles. And then we have part of the immune system called the lymphatic system, where you have lymph nodes in the chest, and you have lymph nodes in the neck, lymph nodes in the groin, in the chest, in the arm. It's called the lymphatic. It's almost like a parallel circulatory system that filters and cleans out interstitial fluid and blood in the body. So let's take a look in a different view, some of these systems, and it's important to know some of the main parts of these systems and some of the main functions. We're going to be covering some of that in AMP1, and then the other systems that we don't cover, you'll cover in AMP2. So the integument or the integumentary system is the skin, hair, nails, and sweat glands. And the function of this is to protect against environmental hazards, right? It's to pretty much keep whatever belongs outside of the body, to keep it on the outside, and to keep what belongs on the inside of the body on the inside. There's different temperatures, there's different pH, right? It's almost like if we're looking at a cell, it would be like the cell membrane or the cell wall, designed to keep what's inside the cell on the inside and keep what belongs outside of the cell on the outside. It helps to regulate body temperature, and it provides a lot of sensory information. This is how you know if a mosquito is crawling on your arm, right? The skeletal system. When we talk about the skeleton, it's the axial skeleton, everything in the center, or the appendicular, which is the extremities, but it involves your bones, your cartilage. Cartilage is between the bones, where you find joints. Ligaments. Ligaments are the soft tissue structure that holds two adjacent bones in alignment to one another. And then there's bone marrow. Your skeletal system and your skeleton is really important. It's a place where muscles are going to attach, so it's involved with locomotion, right? It helps mobilize the body. It protects us. I mean, what other organ has a helmet, right? If you think about it, the brain has a helmet called a skull. So it's designed for protection. If you look at the spinal cord, now here you have 24 freely movable vertebrae, 7 in the neck, 12 in the mid-back, and 5 in the lower back. You have 7 cervicals, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. 7 cervicals, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. The way I teach my students this is just remember you eat at 7 a.m., 12 noon, and 5 p.m. 7, 12, and 5, the 3 times to eat meals throughout the day. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. The bones are like a reservoir. They're storing minerals, especially calcium. So it helps us look at things like osteopenia and osteoporosis in a whole different light, where what is happening to the body that's creating this situation where the body is leaching calcium, where calcium is being pulled out of the bones for some reason. Maybe it's a lack of vitamin D, maybe it's the lack of calcium, maybe the body is too acidic and calcium is being a buffer. So there's a variety of reasons why this can happen. And the bone marrow produces blood cells, okay, especially B cells. When you learn about blood and you do the cardiovascular system, you will learn about red blood cells and white blood cells. In the bone marrow, we have red blood cells that are formed and white blood cells, but specifically the B cells. The T cells are formed and mature in the thymus. So here, when you see what's highlighted here in blue, the question's probably asking, name the highlighted structure. Well, all of them have the answer skeletal in it, and I explained that there was a difference between appendicular and axial skeleton. The appendicular is what we see here in blue. Everything that is bone colored would be the axial skeleton is what you see in blue. The appendicular skeleton would be everything that is bone colored. Okay, everything in the center is axial. Everything that's bone colored is appendicular. The muscular system, we're going to be focusing on skeletal muscle, especially when we get into week 3. We'll cover muscles. There's different types of muscle, right? There's skeletal muscle, which is what we're looking at here in the picture. There's cardiac muscle, which is associated with the heart. And the third type of muscle is called smooth muscle, which is found in arteries, in veins, in organs, things that you can't voluntarily control that constricts or contracts, like a woman's uterus, or arteries that can constrict, or the intestines that can constrict, or the trachea that can dilate or constrict. Anything that is a tubular system within the body that can constrict or dilate has smooth muscle. And again, smooth muscle is involuntary, whereas skeletal muscle is voluntary. Muscles contract and provide movement for us, especially skeletal muscle. It also provides protection, like your abdominal muscles here are going to protect the abdominal organs. We do have the pectoralis muscles here that can protect the heart, as well as the ribs can protect the heart. We have a lot of cervical muscles to protect the delicate arteries, veins, and nerves around the neck. So they do provide a degree of protection. And we know that muscles generate heat because when you're exercising, when muscles, well, in Florida, I don't think you guys know this too well, right? Except I was there around December and there was a pretty cold spell. But in the Northeast, when it's cold and you go outside without a jacket and shorts, within a few minutes, your body's going to start to shiver and shake. And the innate reason for that is when muscles shiver, they generate heat. If you've ever had a fever before and your jaw starts to shiver, it's muscle contraction. It's generating heat. It's designed to help raise your body temperature. When the hypothalamus in the brain can't increase it anymore on its own, it has a backup system. And that's why we have things like febrile seizures, where the eyes roll back and then the muscles go into this quivering, shivering fit, primarily to increase body temperature. The body's pretty amazing. It knows what it's doing to maintain homeostasis at all times. So here, when we look at what's blue, what is highlighted here, would it be the rectus abdominis? Well, those are the abdominal muscles here. Could it be the oblique muscles? Well, no, that's over here. Now we have axial muscles or appendicular muscles. Well, we know that the axial skeleton was in the center and the appendicular skeleton was in the periphery. Now we have axial muscles and appendicular muscles. So the best answer here would be appendicular muscles. Now we look at the neural system, a super important system. When sperm and egg come together somewhere around day 18 to around day 23, 24, somewhere in there, the neural system starts to form. It is the master control center. It is the first system that develops, right? Most people think it's the heart because when you go for a diagnostic medical ultrasound or sonography, and they're looking at the belly and they're doing this ultrasound, then you could say, right? You hear the heartbeat, but before that, it's the actual neural system. The way I try and explain this is the brain would be like the roots of a tree, and then the spinal cord is the trunk of the tree, and then the nerves are the branches. And right now, here we're in springtime in the Northeast, and we're starting to see buds. And then after the buds form, the buds grow into fruit, or the buds grow into leaves. And this is how the organs develop. In a course called embryology, it's actually buds that grow into the organs. So the organs are neurologically controlled. It is the neural system that gives life and function to the health, maintenance, and balance of your organs. So the neural system is the control center and is the first system that forms, which is why chiropractic care in Florida is such a big thing. It's to maintain the integrity of the neural system so that the other organs are functioning in homeostasis. We want to make sure there's no nerve interference going to these organs. The neural system is designed so that there's sensory information that comes in. The brain processes that sensory information and sends out motor output. So sensory information comes in, motor information comes out. That's pretty much like how a computer works. You put data in, it reads the code and spits out information. So now here, what is the highlighted structure? Well, let's see what we have. Does it remove waste? Is it connecting to muscles? Does this destroy foreign invaders? Or is the control center? Ding, 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 ding. Control center. Houston control. Absolutely. The endocrine system is close cousins to the neural system. The neural system uses neurotransmitters to turn on or turn off things. There are certain neurotransmitters that are excitatory, and then there are neurotransmitters that are inhibitory. I'll give you an example. You wake up in the morning, you bounce out of bed, you hear the alarm. There's a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And glutamate is like the accelerator. It's the opening of the flower, if you would, in the morning. Everything comes to fruition, it opens up, we go, 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 go. That's the function of glutamate. Then as the day progresses and the sun starts to go down, glutamate gets converted to GABA, another neurotransmitter. GABA is the brake. It's decelerating. Glutamate is the accelerator, GABA is the brake. GABA slows things down. It's the flower that's closing. So if you get up in the morning and you have no problem getting out of bed when that alarm hits, you have good glutamate. If you have no problem sleeping at night, you have good GABA. But we know there are people that get up in the morning and that alarm goes off, they hit the snooze. Oh, 5 more minutes. Just give me 5 more minutes, please, right? That means that your glutamate levels are not surging as they should, and your GABA may be dominant in the morning. Not a good thing. And then you have some that can't sleep at night because their brain is racing all the time. It can't shut down their thoughts. Then they're glutamate dominant. The accelerator is still going. So just to give you an idea that there are certain neurotransmitters that turn things on, and there's certain things that turn it off. The endocrine system, on the other hand, works with hormones. Again, hormones can turn things on and they can turn things off. And we have different glands that produce different types of hormones that regulate different things. So I will send later this week, I will send out actually, I will send it out during week 4 when we cover the endocrine system. I'll send out some endocrine lectures that I put together, and they're videos of me talking about these different glands, okay? So at this point, be familiar the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland and the adrenals and the pancreas. The gonads are like the testicles and the ovaries. These are all have endocrine function. Now, even the kidneys have endocrine function. Now, we have a system called the reproductive system. Well, that's where the gonads belong. We have a system that's called the renal system, where we do the kidneys, but these organs also overlap into the endocrine system. In fact, pituitary we'll talk about when we do neurology. So we have glands that fall under other systems that have endocrine function. These are going to direct long-term changes and activities in organ systems. The thyroid can adjust and speed up your metabolic activity. We know people have hypoactive thyroids or hyperactive thyroids. Some people can eat, never put on a pound. Some people look at an ice cream sundae and gain 10 pounds, right? So the thyroid is an interesting organ. What's interesting about the thyroid is that the liver is really important in helping the thyroid function, because T4, which is thyroxine, gets converted to T3, which is triiodothyronine, and that T4 to T3 conversion takes place in the liver. So liver function is really important for healthy thyroids, and the mineral selenium is really important for that conversion. A little FYI for nutrition lovers that are in the class. Okay, you know what else is an endocrine organ, believe it or not? It's something that's really important. I just want to plant the seed. Fat cells. Fat cells are metabolically active, and fat cells can release something called cytokines. And cytokines can be very pro-inflammatory. We've heard during COVID that people can have a cytokine storm. And we've also heard with COVID that obesity and morbid obesity and additional fat cells are one of the risk factors associated with COVID. And now you understand why. Let's look here at this picture. Here up at top where the throat is, that's the thyroid gland. Where the sternum is, where the chest is, that's the thymus. Then we look down here, here are the kidneys, or known as renal, right? Renal failure, renal, that's the kidneys. And above the renal is the adrenal, right? Whenever you have the word AD, you're adding something too. So the adrenal or adrenal gland is also known as the suprarenal. Supra means above the renal. So those are the suprarenal or adrenal glands, but it's asking what's the highlighted structure, which is blue. It's not the adrenals, it's not the liver, it's not the kidneys, that would be the pancreas, okay? The pancreas. And the pancreas is a mixed organ. It's a mixed gland. Mixed meaning it has endocrine function and it has exocrine function. Endocrine and exocrine, when a gland has both, we call it a mixed gland. So you may want to look up when we're done, what is endocrine and what is exocrine function? What's the differences? Here we're looking at female reproductive organs. So here is the uterus. Here's the fallopian tubes. Here is the fimbriae, which are like fingers, and here are the ovaries. We have the cardiovascular system, which is the heart, blood, and the blood vessels. And the cardiovascular system is going to distribute blood and water and dissolved gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide and even nitric oxide, waste products, nutrients. It's going to move these things throughout the body. And it's also involved in distributing heat and regulating control of body temperature as well. So here, if this pops up, what is the highlight structure, right? This is that funky, bright blue. Well, it's not the aorta, that's the major blood vessel coming off of the heart. It's not the thymus, that's a gland. It's not the trachea, that's your windpipe. Best answer is the heart. Lymphatic system, this is part of the immune system. We have the spleen, thymus, lymph nodes, lymphatic vessels, and tonsils. These are part of the warrior system of the human body. It helps to defend defend us and fight infections and disease. And it helps to return tissue fluids into the bloodstream. It filters it and cleans it and returns it. The respiratory system, we have an upper respiratory and a lower respiratory tract, but it's the nasal cavity, it's your sinuses, the larynx, the trachea, bronchi, your lungs, and then the deepest part of the lungs called the alveoli. And the main purpose of the respiratory system is to deliver oxygen to your cells, specifically the mitochondria of the cell. We need oxygen into the mitochondria to oxidize sugar or glucose to create energy in the form of ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So we need oxygen in order to provide energy. And every single function of the body requires energy, which means that the parts of the body that need the most energy need the most mitochondria, like muscles and the heart and the brain. They all have lots of mitochondria. So mitochondrial support is really important. There are a variety of diseases out there, like migraine headaches is a mitochondrial dysfunction. Parkinson's and MS and Alzheimer's, these are mitochondrial dysfunctional diseases. So if you can resuscitate and properly nourish the mitochondria, then the body can produce the appropriate energy so that the organs can do the work. When organs can't do the work, they malfunction. What we call malfunction is the body not working at ease or dis-ease, in a state of dis-ease. The respiratory system is not only important for bringing oxygen into the body, but the waste product of cellular metabolism or cellular respiration is called carbon dioxide. So we take in oxygen, the mitochondria uses it. The end result of that Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain that takes place in the mitochondria, its exhaust is called carbon dioxide. The respiratory system is also used for communication to help us produce sound. So right here, we're looking at this highlighted section up here. Is it the throat? What's the best answer? Is it the nasal cavity? If it was nasal cavity, it would just be right here at the tip. If it was the pharynx, it would just be here in the throat. So this is the upper respiratory tract. This is upper, and once you hit that the larynx right here, everything from here down is the lower respiratory tract. Now we look at the digestive system, the teeth, the tongue, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, all different parts of the digestive system. It's designed to process and digest food. It will absorb water and conserve water. It will absorb nutrients, and it's designed to store energy for us. So what is the highlighted structure here in that blue? Well, small versus large intestine. So let's see. Everything in here is small intestine. What's around it that's larger is the large intestine. So the small intestine has that duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. It has those three parts. The colon, or the large intestine, has the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, right? So food or bowel, I should say, after the food is processed here and absorbed, it sends the waste products into the large intestine to help kind of conserve some water, remove the waste products, and the bowel goes ascending, transverse, descending, and eventually out for a healthy bowel movement. So the blue, small intestine, the large intestine surrounds it. The stomach is here, the liver is here, and the gallbladder is that little green structure associated with the liver. So what's highlighted here in the blue? Well, that would be the large intestine in this picture. What's highlighted here, we're looking at a few different things. It's highlighting the liver. It looks like it's highlighting some of the pancreas. It looks like the gallbladder. It looks like the tongue. So what are these structures? Well, it's just not the liver. It's not the digestive tract. The digestive tract would be the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, small and large intestine. But the accessory digestive organs are the things like the pancreas and the gallbladder and the liver and the tongue and the salivary glands. Those are all accessory digestive organs. They're not the primary ones, but they're the helpers. The urinary system is the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, the urethra. It's designed to remove waste products from the blood. All the blood eventually goes to the liver and the kidneys. And they're going to pull out the impurities and again restore clean blood to the system. It controls water balance and regulation. We know when people have edema or swollen ankles, we'll say they're retaining water. That's typically secondary to kidney issues. And the kidneys are a major player in regulating blood pressure. When we get into the endocrine system, I'll cover and explain how the kidneys help to regulate blood pressure. That edema of the ankles, when you can actually push your thumb into the tibia and then you move your thumb away and your finger depression stays in that swollen ankle, they call that pitting edema. Pitting edema. That's when they put the patient on a diuretic like Lasix, and they remove the excess fluid from the body. It's also involved in regulating ion concentration in the body as well as pH, potential hydrogen. Reproductive, for the male reproductive system, we have the testes, the epididymis, the ductus deferens or vas deferens, the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, penis, and scrotum. And the function of that is for sexual intercourse as well as producing the male sex cells, which are sperm. And the testes are also responsible for producing some hormones. The female reproductive tract is the ovaries, the uterine tube, aka fallopian tube, the uterus, vagina, labia, clitoris, the mammary glands, and these two are responsible for producing the female sex cell known as the egg or the oocyte. It helps to support the developing embryo from conception to delivery. That would be the uterus as well as hormones being produced. The mammary glands are providing milk and nourishment for the newborn and sexual intercourse. Now we're going to look at some other terminology. We've already talked about anatomical position. We talked about supine and prone a little bit earlier on. Now we're going to talk about and get into some anatomical reference terminology. We'll also get into the abdominal pelvic quadrants and regions and other reference terms. These are important to know. You'll be hearing these and seeing these throughout AMP1, MP2. So let's get comfortable and familiar with some of these terms. So right here, the entire head or that skull we call cephalic, right? Cephalic is everything up here. That includes the cranial portion and the facial portion. Here, the front of the head, that's called frontal. And there's a bone here called the frontal bone. There's a muscle here called the frontalis. On the side of the head, there's a bone called the temporal bone. And there's a muscle called the temporalis. Right? So it's important to know these regions. And the reason why I bring it up is so that when we cover bones, it's familiar. When we cover muscles, you have reference points and terminology. The eye we call ocular or orbital. The ear is called otic. The cheek is called buccal. So when we cover muscles of the face, you're going to hear of a muscle called the buccinator. The chin is called mental. So when we cover osteology and there's a hole here, holes are called foramen, it's called the mental foramen. The neck is called cervical. The chest is called thorax or thoracic. The breast is called mammary. So the thorax, the mammary, and the abdominal region, this whole region here is called the trunk, including the umbilical region. The armpit is called the axillary region. So when you cover arteries and you hear the axillary artery or the axillary vein or the axillary nerve, knowing the terms tells you where these structures may be found. The arm is called brachium. So when we cover the biceps brachii, or brachialis, we know where the term means. The eye is the orbit. Here's the frontal. Here's the otic. Buccal is cheek. Nasal is nose. Mental is chin. Here in the front of the throat, there's an anterior cervical triangle. And on the other side of this muscle, right, these muscles are called the sternocleidomastoid or the SCM. There's a lateral cervical triangle. A lot of the times we have muscles that create indentations, and they're called triangles. Let's look at some of the lower extremity. Actually, let's look at the wrist here. The wrist is called carpal, right? We have 8 carpal bones. Here's the palmar surface of the hand. Then we have digits called phalanges, and the thumb is called pollicis. I'm going to skip down to the foot because we have similar structures by name. In the wrist, they were called carpals, but in the foot, they're called tarsals. So you have carpals and tarsals. In the toes and the feet, we also have phalanges, just like we did of the hand. In the thumb, it was called pollicis, but of the toe, it's called hallux or hallucis. Okay. The thigh is called femoral. This bone is called femur, so this is the femoral region. The tibia, where the leg is called crural. The kneecap is called the patellar, and the kneecap, the bone, is called the patella. So this is the patellar region. The groin is called inguinal. Right here, this is actually the inguinal ligament in this area. Then we have the pubic, which is in this area, we have the pubic bone. Okay. So now we have, I think this comes from the atlas. So we have to take these structures and drag them over, drag and drop. And it gives you a variety of choices. So the best choice for this part of the head is cephalic. Then this is the facial region. The neck is called cervical. The chest is sternal. Around the breast region is the pectoral region. Right? We know that there is the pectoralis major and pectoralis minor muscles here. The belly button is the umbilicus, and the general stomach region is abdominal. Best choices. If we were to drag carpal, I'd put that here. If I were to do cubital, that would be the elbow crease. And if I were to drag axillary, that would be here in the armpit. Coxal refers to the coccyx, which you really can't see from this view. Here, this region, again, you have drag and drop. You have your choices on the left. So for the neck, the best choice is cervical. Now we call this the thoracic region, abdominal region, pubic region. The foot is also known as the pedal foundation. And you know when you're on a bicycle, there's a pedal for the foot to go on, right? So it's pedal or pedal. This is the lower extremity or lower limb. This is the upper extremity or the upper limb. Look in more detail. These can be found in your atlases, right? So when you look at the textbook, there's an Atlas A and an Atlas B that you need to be comfortable with. So when you look at that, you'll see, okay, these are also drag and drop. So these are, the fingers are called phalanges, but in between, there are interphalange joints. So this is an interphalange, this is an interphalange, this is an interphalange. The thumb is called pollex or pollicis. And then you have muscles at the base of the thumb, and you have muscles at the base of the pinky. These are called, this is called the thenar pad or the thenar eminence. And on the pinky side, it's the hypothenar eminence or hypothenar pad. Here in front of the wrist, these are where we have flexor tendons. In this particular case, flexor, carpi, because it crosses the carpal bones. Radialis, it's more on the radial side. The radial bone is on the thumb side. So the flexor carpi radialis tendon would be here. A little bit more advanced stuff, but when we get into muscles, you'll understand all the different flexor tendons that are on the anterior side of the wrist. Still looking at the hand. Now, the other pictures show the interphalangeal joints. Well, what is this joint called? Well, let me go back here. Here at the wrist, these were carpal bones. After the carpals, these are called metacarpals. So between the metacarpals and the phalanges are the metacarpal phalange joints. Those are your big knuckles. When you make a fist, that creates the knuckles. On the other picture, we had the thenar eminence. On this picture, we have the hypothenar eminence. Here, we could see the creases like these wrinkles. These are the flexor lines. So when you bend your wrist and flex your wrist, the bending occurs at these folds called the flexor lines. And this tendon right down the center is called the palmaris longus tendon. Palmaris longus, it is a long tendon going down the center of the palm, so it's the palmaris longus. Looking at the posterior, the person's posterior, the back again, here's the cephalic region, which is the head region. The neck is cervical. The back is called dorsal. Dorsal is the back. Here's your upper limb. The back of the elbow is called the olecranon region. The highest point of the shoulder is called acromial. When you do the scapula, you'll see there's an acromion process, which is the shoulder's highest point. Looking at the female posterior again, at the shoulder, right, you give a bunch of choices here. So the acromion would be here. This is the scapula, so this is the medial border of the scapula. I'm going to go through these terms, what medial means, but here's the medial border of the scapula. There's a rotator cuff muscle on the back of the scapula called the infraspinatus. There's a large muscle called the trapezius, so in this area is where the trapezius muscle lies. At the bottom of the scapula is the inferior angle of the scapula, way at the bottom. In the lower back, there's a latissimus dorsi in this region. And then along the lower back, close to the spine, are the erector spinae muscles. And again, this would be drag and drop. This is the back, around the scapula here. This is the left scapula, right scapular region. At the inferior angle of it, there's a little triangle called the triangle of auscultation. This term auscultate is to listen with a stethoscope. So when we put our stethoscope here and have a patient inhale and exhale, it's one of the areas that allows us to hear the lung sounds. It's the triangle of auscultation. Here's the vertebral region. Here's the sacral region, and here is the lower back or lumbar region. The tush, right, this is the gluteal region. We have a gluteus maximus, a gluteus medius, and a gluteus minimus, large gluteal muscles. Behind the knee is called the popliteal region. The front of the knee was called the patella, but behind it where the crease is called popliteal. The calf is called the sural. The heel is called calcaneal because that's the calcaneus. And then underneath the foot is called the plantar surface of the foot. The cranial region is the skull. Nuchal means neck, right? Neck, nuchal. Between the scapulas are interscapular. And again, you wouldn't have to type these in. These would be choices that you would drag and drop. Scapula, vertebral, and the back of the hand is called the dorsum of the hand. The front of the hand is called the palmar surface. The back of the hand is called the dorsum. The top of the foot is also known as dorsum. The top of the foot is the dorsum, the foot is plantar surface. When we look above the clavicle, which is the clavicle is here, supra means above, so this is the supraclavicular fossa. A fossa is a smooth depression. A fossa is a smooth depression. The highest point of the shoulder is the acromion. The muscle around the outside or lateral part of the shoulder is called the deltoid. This is the clavicle bone. This is the upper trapezius muscle. Here's your thyroid cartilage, also known as the Adam's apple. And here's the sternocleidomastoid, named after its origin and insertion. The origin is on the sternum and the clavicle, so it's sternocleido. Mastoid is the bone just behind the ear. In front of the flap of the ear, there's a bony part called the mastoid process. When we do osteology, we'll point it out to you. Above the sternum, right, this is all sternum. These are important landmarks. The top of the sternum is called suprasternal notch. That's the depression at the top. Then we have the manubrium, which is the upper part of the sternum. Then between the manubrium and the body of the sternum, there's an angle called the sternal angle, sometimes called the angle of Louis. It's where the manubrium and the body come together. You can actually palpate it on yourself. There's a horizontal bump that we all have in this area. And the significance of this horizontal bump is that it's always in alignment with the second rib. So when we listen to a patient's heart sound or breathing sounds, whenever you take courses on how to do a physical exam, you will have to place the stethoscope at the second intercostal space or the third intercostal space or the fifth intercostal space. Intercostal means between ribs. And in order to count them, you have to have a reference point. So finding the sternal angle, which is the second rib, once you drop inferior to that, below that, it's the second intercostal space. Then third rib, then third intercostal space, fourth rib, fourth intercostal space, okay? The very tip of the sternum is called the xiphoid process. It's right at the base. When we look at the posterior portion, the ulnar side, I said the radial bone is on the thumb side, the ulnar bone is on the pinky side. So from this view, there's a little bit of a flexor carpi ulnaris. On this side, on the thumb side, there's a politician muscle. It's called the brachioradialis. Politician because I call it the hand shaking muscle. On the front or anterior part of the brachium is the biceps brachii, and then on the posterior part is the triceps brachii. Anterior deltoid, middle deltoid, and posterior deltoid. The deltoid is named by its shape. It looks like the delta, the Greek letter delta, and there's an anterior part, a middle part, and a posterior part of it. When we look at the forearm, there are some major landmarks to know. The biceps brachii is up here. The medial epicondyle is here. Medial means on the inside. Lateral means on the outside. So this is the medial epicondyle. This would be the lateral epicondyle region. All the flexors are on the anterior forearm. When I say all the flexors, any muscle that's on the anterior forearm crosses the wrist, it's going to flex the wrist. So these are all flexors on the anterior forearm. Extensors are on the posterior forearm. When we look at the thigh, again, here's the terms medial and lateral. Medial is on the inside, lateral is on the outside. The quadricep muscles are up here. They attach to the patella by the quadriceps tendon. Tendons are what connects a muscle to a bone. The bone is called a patella. So the quadriceps tendon is right here. The patellar ligament goes from bone to bone. So going from the patella to the tibial tuberosity is the patellar ligament. Ligaments go bone to bone. Tendons go from muscle to bone. And on the lateral part of the thigh, there's a large band called the iliotibial band. It goes from the ilium, way up here at your waistline, all the way down to the tibia, which is the leg. When we look down at the ankle, there are some important landmarks to familiarize yourself with. When you're looking at the great toe, this is the inside and the instep, so this is the medial malleolus, and if there's a medial malleolus, on the other side, there'll be a lateral malleolus. You can't see it from this view, though. Here is the Achilles tendon, also known as the calcaneal tendon. Here's the calcaneus. Here's the medial arch, or the medial longitudinal arch. It's one of the things I check on all my patients. I happen to have a thermographic 3D scanner that I have all my patients step on their first visit. And the foot tells me a whole lot of what's happening above it. What's happening at the knees, what's happening at the hips, what's happening at the spine, at the shoulders. The feet are the first floor that you're stepping on. So if the feet are flat, it's going to have negative impact on the tibia, the knee, the hips, the sacrum, pelvic alignment, spine, all the way up to the neck. And here's the head of the metatarsal. In the hand, you had metacarpals. In the foot, you have metatarsals. So here are metatarsals. In the toes, you have phalanges. In the atlas, I think this is found in Atlas B. I think Atlas B is found after chapter 10. It's one of those atlases that you need to be familiar with. There are some major structures like this abdominal aorta, a major blood vessel that brings oxygen to all the internal organs of the abdominal region. It's called the abdominal aorta. Off the heart was the aorta that's up here. That's the arch of the aorta on top, but the abdominal aorta is in the abdominal region. Then attaching to the kidneys, you have the ureters, and the ureters are going to attach to the urinary bladder, which stores urine. The uterus, the ureter, and the ovaries, those are all interrelated. So the ovary, that's what is going to produce the egg. When the egg is produced and the woman ovulates, it propels the egg up into the uterine tube or fallopian tube. And then that egg is going to move in this direction to find a way into the uterus. Whereas the sperm come in, find a way into the uterus, up into the fallopian tubes to try and fertilize the egg. Right? Fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube, whereas implantation of the egg should happen in the uterus. If implantation takes place anywhere outside of the uterus, we call it an ectopic pregnancy. Here we're looking at the sternum. Remember before we called this part the manubrium. Here is the body, and here's the xiphoid process. This structure going across was the angle, sometimes called the sternal angle or angle of Louis. And I said the significance of that, it's always at the second rib. So here's the first rib, here's the second rib, here's the second intercostal space. There's muscle in between each rib called intercostal muscles. The double M means muscle. So here's the internal intercostal muscle. Here's the lung, and the pleura is just the tissue that surrounds the lungs. More main structures of the lower portion. Here's the sartorius muscle, longest muscle in the body. Here is the adductors. There's the word AD. Adduction brings extremities towards the midline. Adduction means you're bringing something to the midline. So these muscles here, this one in particular is called the adductor longus. Second longest muscle in the body is the gracilis. Here's your femoral vein, right in here. And a branch that kind of comes off of that is the greater saphenous vein. Here's one of your quadricep muscles called the vastus lateralis, and another quadricep called the rectus femoris. We're going to go through these muscles again during week 3. So you heard me use some of these words like superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral. You have to be familiar with them. I'll show you what these look like on a person, including proximal, distal. These are opposites. Superficial and deep. These are opposites. Contralateral and ipsilateral. Those are opposites. So I'd like to show you these on a person. So when we look at the upper limb, we use the word proximal and distal. When you're moving closer to the beginning point, to the trunk, we call that proximal. When we're moving further away from it, we're moving distally. Same thing with the lower extremity. Proximal is when you're moving closer to the trunk. Distal is when you're moving away. Superior and inferior is in reference to the body as a whole. So when we're moving upward, we're moving superiorly. When we're moving downward, inferiorly. But once we're looking at one of the extremities, we use the word proximal and distal. Medial and lateral. When we're moving towards the midline of the body, we say we're moving medially. When we're moving away from midline, we say we're moving laterally. When, again, here's superior and inferior. When we're moving to the front of the body, it's anterior, also known as ventral. When we're moving behind the body, we're moving posteriorly or dorsal. When we're moving to the head, we're moving cranially. When we're moving to the tail, we're moving caudally. Head, tail, cranial, caudal. When we look at this structure here, when we look at moving to midline, this is medial. When we're moving away from midline, we're moving lateral. When we're moving towards the trunk or towards the beginning of the body part, that's proximal, whether it's the upper or lower extremity. When we're starting here and we're moving away, or we're starting here and moving away, that's distal. When we're moving in reference point to the body, moving upward, that was superior. Inferior would have been if the arrow is pointing down. Caudal is if it was pointing to the tail. Anterior is moving to the front of the person. Posterior is moving to the back of the person. Now we have the term superficial and deep. Superficial is moving closer to the surface, so the arrows are pointing outwards towards the skin. Deep is when you're starting at the skin and you're moving internally. So anterior and posterior are opposites, superficial and deep are opposites. Now we're going to talk a little bit about planes. I'm going to move away from this. I'll come back to it. Well, I'll cover it now. So this line that we see going right down, up and down, this is called the mid-sagittal plane. Corresponding to that, adjacent to it, I should say, adjacent to it is another line, sometimes called parasagittal or just sagittal. And now we have a line that runs transversely to it. That's called a transverse plane. Okay, I'll go through other planes on another image. That was kind of out of sequence. Here it's asking what makes up the lateral border of this region. So it's using this word lateral. Okay, so what makes up the lateral border? So medial is midline, lateral is moving away. So we have to go to what this muscle is, and that's called the sternocleidomastoid. Let's look at the abdominal regions. We break the abdominal regions into 4 abdominal pelvic quadrants. This person's in anatomical position, so they're looking at us. So this is their right shoulder. This is their left shoulder. This is the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. Why is understanding this important? Because typically when a patient comes in or they go to ER or there's a complaint, if I ask the patient, where's your discomfort? Can you point to it? And the patient points here, right? I'm going to document my notes by saying patient came in pointing to the right upper quadrant, claimed the pain on a scale of 1 to 10 was a 10, right? So patient pointed to their right lower quadrant, pain was a 11 on a scale of 1 to 10. Okay, so we talk about quadrants, and in each quadrant, we have different organs. So if someone was pointing to the right lower quadrant and it was really painful on palpation, which means to touch, maybe this structure right here, known as the appendix, is inflamed and they have an acute appendicitis. If they have pain in the right upper quadrant, perhaps the liver is inflamed, like in a hepatitis, or maybe they have gallstones. Okay. What is this structure here that's highlighted? That large organ is known as the liver. Now, besides quadrants, we have regions. And it's important to know these regions because sometimes on the lab exam, you'll get these drag and drop questions. So I like to start naming them by the belly button first, which is the umbilical region. And then gastric means stomach, epi means above, hypo means below. So above the stomach is the epigastric region, and then below it is the hypogastric. So umbilical, epigastric, hypogastric, also known as the pubic region because it's close to that. Then we have near the inguinal region a left and right inguinal region. In the lumbar area, it's a left and right lumbar region. And then where the ribs are, the ribs we call chondriac. So where there's a hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, and a right hypochondriac. And again, you may be asked to drag and drop these areas for points. The lumbar region is also known as the flanks. So maybe someone has left flank pain or right flank pain. Here's your umbilical. Here's the epigastric and hypogastric. Hypogastric is pubic. Left hypochondriac, right hypochondriac. Remember, the person's in anatomical position facing us, and then a right and left inguinal region. So there's the tic-tac-toe with a number sign, and again, the same organs overlap into those 9 regions. This is just a picture showing the blue 4 quadrants and the red the 9 regions. This is just, again, summarizing for you to remember: proximal to distal, medial to lateral, anterior to posterior, cranial to caudal. Now let's look at the planes. So when we look at this woman here on the right-hand side, we see that we can divide the body into different planes. One plane going from front to back, this is called the sagittal plane. And this separates the body into equal left and right halves. So that is the sagittal plane. So we can see on this image, it's separating into left and right halves. Now we have this plane separating the body into a front half and a back half called the frontal plane. And then we have this plane called the transverse plane that when we take a slice of the body that way, it gives us like a bird's eye view looking down and into the body. So it's important to know these because we do a lot of diagnostic imaging. Some of you are getting into radiology or doing ultrasounds, and we need to look at different organs and body parts from different planes. So this one going across is the transverse plane. When we look at MRIs, this is the sagittal plane. This is the frontal plane separating to a front and back half. And this is the transverse plane looking down into the brain where you can see the ventricles. Okay, here is the cerebrum, here is the nose, here is the tongue, here's the cerebellum, here's the medulla, is your C1 vertebra and C2 vertebrae. Okay, here, look at this question. So it's getting like two for the price of one here. What is the medial border of the highlighted region? All right, well, here's the highlighted region. Now you got to know, what does medial mean? Well, what is this medial border, right? This is the superior border. This is the lateral border. This is the medial border. So the medial border would be the sagittal plane or mid-sagittal plane, whichever choice they give you would be correct. Okay, we're getting close to the end. We're going to be finishing up here with cavities. So we have different type of cavities in the body, and I'll take questions at the end if you have any. I know we covered a lot of information. You're not supposed to memorize everything the first time around. It's just me introducing you to the ideas, and then you can review them when we're finished. So the purpose of cavities is to protect organs from accidental shock in the body, and it also permits different changes in the size and shape of the internal organs located within the cavities. We have a thoracic cavity, we have an abdominal pelvic cavity, we have a cranial cavity. I'm going to show you the diaphragm that separates these. So here on the right, you can see anterior and posterior, right? We're looking at the person from the lateral view. Here's the thoracic cavity that has the lungs and the heart contained within it. Where the lungs are contained is called the pleural cavity. Where the heart is contained, it's called the pericardial cavity. So both pleural and pericardial cavities lie within the thoracic cavity. Down below, we have an abdominal pelvic cavity. The two main cavities, there are three here, but the main two cavities would be the abdominal cavity, where your abdominal organs are, and then there's a pelvic cavity where your reproductive organs are. Separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity is this muscle here called the diaphragm. Okay, notice the diaphragm does attach to your spine. That's why posture can affect your ability to breathe properly for oxygenation. So here you would have to, drag and drop. This is the cranial cavity. This is the vertebral cavity. This is the pleural cavity. This is the abdominal cavity. This is the pelvic cavity. And this muscle here is the diaphragm. If it asked for what cavity is this, I didn't teach you a head cavity. I did teach you cranial cavity and vertebral cavity, so best answer is cranial cavity. Then you'll have to drag and drop, right? We have a dorsal cavity and ventral cavity. So you have to be able to kind of identify and go, all right, what do we have that's in the front? And then what do we know that's more in the back, right? So now we'll go, all right, cranial cavity is in the back, vertebral canal and spinal cord and the meninges that protect the spinal cord, that would all be dorsal. Then the abdominal cavity, the diaphragm, the lungs, and the mediastinum is in the ventral cavity. I'll show you where the mediastinum is in a second. So here's the mediastinum right here. So the mediastinum is this space where you have like the esophagus and the trachea. It's the space that's kind of deep to the sternum, but anterior to your vertebral column and between the ribs. That space is the mediastinum. All right, the thoracic cavity is where the mediastinum is, but it's also where the pleural cavity and pericardial cavity is. Peri means around, cardial is for heart, pleura is lungs. Here's the abdominal cavity, and here's the pelvic cavity. Pelvic cavity is where the bladder is and the reproductive organs, etc. So now what I'm going to show you are cavities a little bit close up and a little bit more identified. But I want you to see that we have this term parietal and visceral. parietal pleura and visceral pleura. The parietal layer is the layer mostly on the outside of the organ, whereas the visceral pleura is the layer that's closer to the organ. And then between the visceral and the parietal layer, if we're talking about the lungs, right, this is the visceral pleura. This is the parietal pleura. Pleura means lung. And in between is a pleural cavity, which is just the space between the two. Same concept applies to the heart. Heart, we use the word pericardium. So closest to the organ of the heart is the visceral pericardium. What lines the cavity of it is the pericardial, the parietal pericardium. Again, visceral pericardium, closest to the organ, closest to the cavity on the outside, parietal pericardium, and then between the two layers is the pericardial cavity. Let me show you, I'm going to come back, but let me just show you again, isolated. If you were to put your fist into a balloon, and let's say your fist is the heart or the organ, the layer that's coming into contact with your fist or the organ, that's known as the visceral layer. And the layer on the other side of the balloon, on the outside, is the parietal. So now if we apply that to the heart, here is the visceral pericardium. On the outer layer is the parietal pericardium. And then between the two is the pericardial cavity. And you could apply this concept to the lungs. Then we just take out the word pericardium and you would put pleura. And then if we're talking about the digestive organs, we take out the word pericardium and we put in the word peritoneum. We just change the word. Lungs is pleura, heart is pericardium, and around the digestive organs is peritoneum. And then the word visceral and parietal you would apply. So let's look here at the lungs. All right, so we're taking this section here, we're blowing it up. So here's the lung, right, the pink stuff. Here, closest to the organ is the visceral pleura. Pleura means lung. All the way on the outside is the parietal pleura. And then way on the inside is that pleural cavity. Here's the lung, and here's your diaphragm. Now here we're looking at the heart. What is the highlighted part? Right, so here's the highlighted part. Here's the outer part. And then the cavity is the space between the two. So best answer, look, they're giving visceral pericardium or parietal. The highlighted part in blue is visceral pericardium. Parietal pericardium would be this one. And then pericardial cavity would be between the two. Now, when we look at the abdominopelvic region, we use the word peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum and a visceral peritoneum. Same concept that we talked about with the heart and that we talked about with the lungs. So here are all of the digestive organs. We could see a little bit of the liver. We could see some of the stomach, some of the intestines. So here, they want to know what this blue layer is that is surrounding the periphery of that. And they're giving visceral peritoneum or parietal peritoneum. What's lining the cavity of it is the parietal. If it was inside here, that would be visceral. But this is all the way in the outer chamber. Now behind the peritoneum, like here, retro means behind or in the past, right? So here, like the pancreas, is retroperitoneal. Even the kidneys are retroperitoneal. It's what makes pancreatic cancer and kidney cancer, especially the pancreas, such a painful type of cancer because it's so tightly connected to the retroperitoneal cavity. There's not a lot of space between the ribs, the spine, and the muscles here. So when the pancreas gets large, it becomes a little bit painful. Okay, so that's the retroperitoneum, where you have the pancreas, the kidneys, the ureters, and then some parts of the digestive tract are behind the peritoneum. Okay, um, finishing up here, 2 more minutes, we'll be done. Just wanted to mention that besides the macroscopic stuff, don't forget to review some of the microscopic stuff. I will send out a video this week on me talking about the cell and the different parts of the cell. So you have to know the different organelles that are inside of the cell, like the Golgi apparatus, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, the lysosomes, not just the structures of identifying what they look like, but knowing what their functions are. After all, we're talking about anatomy and physiology, structure and function, whether it's macroscopic or microscopic. So there's so many other structures like the nucleus, the nucleolus, cilia, microvilli, cell membrane, lysosomes. There's so many different structures, but you do have to know to identify them and what their functions are. So the Golgi apparatus is going to modify and package newly synthesized proteins, but the synthesized proteins are actually produced by the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They synthesize the proteins for secretion out of a cell and for utilization within the cell. The mitochondria, which are these structures here, that's involved in ATP production, adenosine triphosphate, which provides energy for the cell. The lysosomes, these are structures that are going to dump hydrogen into any foreign invader that has come into the cell to try and break it down and destroy it. It releases these hydrogen digestive enzymes to break things down and to remove damaged organelles. Then here you have to be able to drag and drop, okay, things that can be found along the cell surface, like cilia, which are these things here, microvilli, which are the smaller extensions here, and the plasma membrane, also known as the cell membrane, going around it. The cytoplasm, which is everything between the cell membrane and the nucleus. Everything in here is the cytoplasm. And we have all of these structures like the cytoskeleton, the mitochondria, and the Golgi apparatus all fall within the cytoplasm. And when we're talking about the nucleus in particular, this structure here, we have the nucleolus, which produces RNA. We have cellular DNA and chromosomes all involved around the nucleus. When you talk about the cell membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer, you have to be able to identify the difference between peripheral proteins at the bottom and integral proteins which cross through the actual cell membrane. And some of the integral proteins actually make up a channel. So a protein channel, like a sodium channel, a calcium channel, this channel is like a tunnel that allows things to move from outside of the cell, extracellularly, to intracellularly. The body uses channels, protein channels for that. And there's a membrane pore or a membrane channel pore in between the channel protein. And then we have glycoproteins as well. So you have to be able to identify these structures for drag and drop. Here, it's asking not necessarily what is the name of this structure, right? It's not asking anatomy, it's asking physiology. So once we know that these are microvilli and these are cilia, microvilli are used to increase the cell surface area of the cell. And it involves a little bit of, it facilitates transport as well. Here, we're looking at the mitochondria, but it's not asking for the structure, it's asking for the function which produces the ATP in the cell by a mechanism called the Krebs cycle, known as cellular respiration. Now it's asking, what is this structure? This is called the endoplasmic reticulum. And it's actually rough because it has ribosomes attached and it gives it a rough appearance. So they call it the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which we have to look at the choices here. Does it regulate, transport, and modify proteins? No, but it is involved in synthesizing proteins, but in which way? Is it synthesizing proteins that inhabit the cytosol, meaning it's just used for here, or it synthesizes proteins for secretion or insertion into the plasma membrane and lysosomal enzymes? So what you need to do is look at what is the difference between what do ribosomes do, what does the rough endoplasmic reticulum do compared to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And I'll send you another lecture on that this week. Here we're looking at the Golgi complex or Golgi apparatus, and that's going to regulate the transport and modify the synthesized proteins that the rough endoplasmic reticulum produced. And then again, just more identification of different organelles. So make sure you run through the interactive exercises where you can actually drag and drop and name the structures and then say, do I know the name and do I know the function? Structure, function, structure, function, structure, function. Cilium helps to mobilize the cell, microvilli for absorption. And then in terms of different types of proteins, you have microtubules, which are pretty large proteins. Then you have intermediate filaments, which are medium-sized proteins. And then we have microfilaments that are much smaller proteins. But the intermediate filaments and microfilaments and microtubules, they're all part of the cytoskeleton. They help to maintain the structure of the cell. Here we have the centrosomes. The centrosome you're going to hear about when you review a video I will send you on mitosis. Mitosis will go over the steps of how cells divide and multiply. Cells need to reproduce and regenerate and multiply because cells die. And they just don't want to die. They have to leave something back and allow them to reproduce and produce more. So when we talk about mitosis, you'll hear of things like prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. I call it PMAT, P-M-A-T, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. You have to know what they look like, and you also have to know what's actually taking place at each of those levels. And of course, we have the outer cell membrane, also known as a plasma membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer. Again, these are more structures known as organelles. We have a nucleus, which is the center core. This is what does the coding. It has the codes or the DNA template. The nucleolus is deep to that. This is what produces your ribosomes and your ribosomal RNA. These are free ribosomes out here. We have nuclear pores, which are just holes within the nucleus. Those are some of the main structures. Okay, let me stop the recording here and see if any of you have any questions.